We're up to Daf Tes Vav, and we got up to Boy Minei Rabbi Yochanan mi Rabbi Yana, which is approximately 10 lines down from the top. And we'll just review that what we're focused on here is Chanota versus Lakita. And especially with regard to the Esrog and Persa Elon, what determines which year of the Shemitah cycle these peros belong to? Is it the Chanota or is it the Lakita? And we have on this point a machlokes between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, which Mora had mentioned back on Daf Yudali ways. And according to Rabbi Gamliel, everything is determined by Chanota. And it seems that we do accept the Shita Rabbi Gamliel. However, Rabbi Eliezer has another opinion, a different opinion, according to which it's not Chanota that's critical, but rather Lakita. So, boy, minei Rabbi Yochanan mi Rabbi Yana. Esrog, Rosh Hashana Shelo, Amosai. The question of Rosh Hashana with regard to Esrog, as to whether or not it's Shvat or Tishrei, whether or not the Esrog has the status of all Peros Elon, which means that Shvat is Rosh Hashana for an Esrog, or maybe the Esrog is different than other Peros Elon. And in a striking way, it's very similar to Yerek, to vegetables, because it's Gadol al Rov Mayim, which means it's not just rainwater that determines when the esrog and how it will grow, but rather it's also an issue of irrigation. And if, on the other hand, we're going to take the second approach, that we equate esrog with Yerek, then we come to the conclusion that like Yerek, which has Aleph Tishrei as Rosh Hashanah L'Yiroko, so too the Esrog, setting itself as the exception to the rule of all Peros, would be like a Yerek, and its Rosh Hashanah would be Aleph Tishrei. Amalei, Rabbi Yana responded to Rabbi Yochanan that the Rosh Hashanah for Esrog, like that of all Peros, is Shvat. Now the Gemara asks a second question. Rabbi Yochanan comes back with a second query to Rabbi Yana. Shvat de Chadoshim or Shvat de Tkufa? So the year is broken up into 4 Tkufos. And when you talk about Shvat as Rosh Hashanah, one way is to say that it goes according to the lunar calendar, which is called Shvat de Chadoshim. And then the cheshbon goes based on the molad of the levanim. When you saw the levanim, that's called Shvat. But there's another way of defining Rosh Hashanah, the Esrog, and for that matter, for Peros. That's Shvat the Tkufa. So we're talking about the Tkufa Tzachama. Now we're going according to the solar calendar. And the Tkufa Tzachama, let's say we're talking now about the Tkufa of Teves, and it begins 30 days later. So Shvat, from the perspective of Tkufa Sachama, begins 30 days after the beginning of Tkufas Teves. And that's when the fruits will grow based on the sun, on the solar calendar. And Rashi here quotes, Tosfos quotes a pasuk in Devarim. It says, "Mimeged tvuos shemesh." So it means that the tvua grows according to the sun. The Ritva has another interpretation why Tkufas Hachama is critical here, is Kovea. And he says that the rains are controlled by the Tkufas Hachama. And the reason why we choose the 15th of Shvat as Rosh Hashanah Leilon is because of the rains. As we said back on Daf Yudalid, Kfar Yotzu Rov Gishmei Shana. But since Gishmei Shana depends upon the Tkufas Hachama, that's what's going to impact on the rains. Therefore, the Gemara thinks, Rabbi Yochanan has a tzad to say, that Shvat should be calculated according to the Tkufas Hachama. Now, the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos, and also in Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh, has a long discussion about the Kufos. He basically says that if you're talking about the number of days in a particular year according to the lunar calendar of 12 months on a regular calendar year, so that comes out to 354 days, 8 hours, and a bunch of halakim. If it's in an Iber Shana, which has 13 months, then the number of days equals 383 days and 21 hours and change. And as far as the number of days in a solar calendar year, it's always going to be 365 plus 6 hours. So the discrepancy between the solar year and the lunar year in a regular year is going to be 10 days, 21 hours, and X number of chalot. In a Shana Muberes, we realign the year of the lunar calendar to fit with the year of the solar calendar, making up for that 10-day difference on an annual basis. Now, as far as determining when it's Chag Pesach, the Kufos, according to the solar calendar, the Mos Hachama will determine when Pesach. And as we said before, there are 4 Kufos in the solar year, approximately 91 1/3 days for each Tkufa. And since the solar year is longer than the lunar year in a regular year by 10 days approximately, therefore the beginning and the end of each Tkufa will be different on any, let's say, lunar calendar year, as we said before. Amalei, Rabbi Yanai responds to Rabbi Yochanan's second question, the Chadashim. We're going to use the lunar calendar to determine when is Shvat as far as Rosh Hashanah Leperes Eilan. And Tosfos quotes a pasuk again in the same exact verse. It says Umimeged Geresh Yerachim Midvar Lamed Gimel. And here Yerachim is a reference to the lunar calendar. And the Chassam Sofer wonders, how could the lunar calendar make any difference? We're talking about, when the rains are going to come down, and that's clearly determined by the solar calendar. How can we use the lunar calendar? So, right, it's very wonderful that the Jewish nation counts their months according to the lunar calendar. That's not going to change nature. And therefore, the moisture within the lanos that's responsible for the growth of the peiros is not going to change based on the lunar calendar. It should be reflected by Yimei Alavonim. And the Chassam Sofer is so bothered by this question that he comes to the conclusion that the nature will change He quotes Yerushalmi to this effect based on the laws of the Torah. Very strange. What's the din of Rosh Hashana Lilanos as far as the month of Shvat is concerned? Because the first of the two Adars in an Iviyar is really coming to replace Shvat. So maybe we should postpone Rosh Hashanah Lilanos in an Iviyar by 1 month. Or should we say no? That since on any other year we will calculate Rosh Hashanah based on Shvat, the Shvat that comes right after Teves, we're not going to change it because it's in Ivriya. And the Rosh Hashanah will now remain in Shvat. Logically, one could have argued that in such a year where you added another month, then Rosh Hashanah for Ilana should be the 15th of Adar, the first Adar, rather than the 15th of Shvat Amalei, where Rav Nachman responds to Rava, Halech Acharov Shanim. What's going to determine Rosh Hashanah is going to be the average year, most years. And most years are not leap years. And therefore, the month which we call Shvat, which is right after Teves, that's going to be the month of Rosh Hashanah Lilanos. Now we start our main sugya today, and that is getting back to the issue of Chanata versus Lakita. And there are a number of different possibilities here. So it becomes a good challenge. We'll see. Hopefully, Siyata Dishmaya will figure it all out. Now, once you differentiate between Chanata and Lakita, so you could always talk about a case of fruits. I'm going to focus on an esrog whose Chanata took place last year, but the Lakita took place this year. And that's going to be a relevant issue, how to classify those peros, so they belong to last year or this year, not only with regard to Maser, because each year's fruits have to be subject to their own hafrashas mas. I can't be mafresh last year's, that's Yashan, on this year's, which is Chadash, or vice versa. And another nafkamina is going to be as far as Shmita is concerned. Let's say you had fruits or an esrog, let's say, that took Chanata on the 6th year, but the Lakita didn't take place till the 7th year. Does it belong to the 7th year? And it's Kodesh B'Kedusha Shvius or not? You could have the reverse case. You could have a case going forward where the Peros had Chanata on the 7th year, which is the Shemitah year, but the Lakita didn't take place till the 8th year. So what determines the year of an esrog? Is it Chanata or is it Lakita? And that's relevant to both Masros and Shvius. Omar Rabbah. Now there are two parts to Rabbah's statement. Esrog Bashish Shenichasa L'Shvius. He points out here in the footnote that sometimes the esrog appears in the Torah B'Lashon Nekeva. That's why he calls it Bas Shishis. Anyway, this esrog had its Chanata in the 6th year, but its Lakita took place in the 7th year. Now, what I'm going to suggest is let's kind of anticipate intuitively what should be the status of this esrog. Does it belong to the 6th year or to the 7th year? And this is relevant to two halachos. Why? Because Eros Shvius are potter min hamas. Number two, Eros Shvius, when mafkir the sada, people come in and take whatever's left there requires after a certain calendar date biur. So what's the status of an esrog whose Chanata took place in the 6th year, but the Lakita in the 7th year. And Rabbit says something very surprising. He says, P'tur ben Amaser, P'tur ben Abir. Let's start back. P'tur ben Abir means that it belongs to the 6th year, not to the 7th year, because pairs of the 7th year require beer. And the Gemara Psachim Daf Nun Beis derives this from a pasuk at the end of Sefer Vayikra. It says, "L'behemtecha l'chai asher b'yatzecha tia kol t'vasol echol." And the Gemara says that kol zman shachai ochels b'sadeh, as long as the animals out in the fields, out in the wild, are still eating from that from that specific species of grains or fruits, is then you can feed your animals at home, your domestic animals, meaning you don't have to take the shvius, the pair of shvius, out of your house. When the animals are no longer eating from this mid because it's no longer growing in the fields, then you have to take out any shvius, any pair of shvius that are still left in your house. And that's called beer. I don't know exactly what you do with it. I mean, that's a whole issue about what's required with regard to pairs that you're makayim the mitzvah of beer. But one thing is clear, according to everybody, you have to take it out of your house. And the Mishnah in Shvius in the 9th parak establishes that there are 3 different arotzos lebir. We divide up Eretz Yisrael into 3 different sections: Yehuda, Evar, Yarden, Vagdolia. And each one of these arotzos is subdivided into 3 categories as well, divided to 3 areas. And all this is because of the mitzvah of beer. Now, Rabbah is telling me that in our case, P'tur ben Abir means that it doesn't have Kedushas Peros Shvius because the Chanata determined the year, and it had Chanata in the 6th year. So I understand P'tur ben Amaser, but then he says P'tur ben Abir, but then he says P'tur ben Amaser, going up the ladder here. He doesn't give Maser. Now, if it's Shishiv, then why shouldn't he be Chayv in Maser? Well, let's go on to the second statement of Rabbah. Now, I have an esrog whose chanata took place during the 7th year, and the Lakita was in the 8th year. Now, this I can already anticipate what Rabbah is going to say, and I think we could hit the nail on the hammer. Namely, that since the Chanata took place in the 7th year, it has Kedusha Shvius. Therefore, number 1, it's Potem and Amas. Number 2, you have the mitzvah of Shvius, which means Chayeves B'Bir. So that makes sense. The second statement of Rabbah fits into a beautiful pattern, but the first statement of Rabbah about the P'tur Maser, in the case where the Chanata took place in the 6th year, why should it be P'tur min Amaser? Amalei Abaye, Bishlei Maseifa L'Chumra. I understand the consistency in your Seifa, which means that since you're being Machmir and you hold that Holchan Achar Chanata, so if the Chanata took place in the 7th year, therefore you're obligated to treat these peros, in this case the esrog, as Shvius. I'm sorry. Since we're going basar, as Shvius, because the Chanot took place in the 7th year. Therefore, mainly you have to be mafkir them, and once you mafkir them, then you put them in a maser, because in general, hefker is put them in a maser, because the Torah says in Dvarim Perik Yudal, it says Ba Halevi with regard to maser, ki ein lo chelik v'nachla imach. And this is qualifying that maser only applies in a case where he is left out. In other words, the Levi would have been excluded, so therefore the Torah commands you to give maser. But in the case of hefker, where the Levi has the same chelik and nachla as you do, then there is no chiyuv mas. So since in the case of Chanota b'Shvius, which is the sefer of Rabbah, it's chayiv in Shvius because basar Chanota is leading, therefore it's chayiv in Biur. And at the same time, it's potem in a maser, because as we said, Shvius is potem in a maser, like Hefker is potem in a maser. Shvius, in that context, has the same din as Hefker, although Beit Shammai disagree with that, but that we're going according to the normative halach. Now you might ask me, is there a contradiction to the Reisha? Because in the first case of Rabbah, where the Chanot took place in Shishis, nevertheless, Rabbah says he's potem in a maser. Why should he be potem in a maser? If it does not have kedusha shvius, you tell me it's pturim in a biur because again you're being consistent. That azlina basa chanota. So for that token, it should be chayv and maser. It belongs to shishis. It doesn't belong to shvius. So Rashi points out that that's not difficult. Why? Because it could be that Rabbah has a suffix. He vacillates about this din because according to Rav Gamliel, as quoted in the Brisa on Daf Yudalid, in Esro, we go basar chanata for shvius, but lekita lamase. Meaning that we classify esrog as a yerek with regard to Maser. And the reason for that is because it's Godel al Rov Mayim, like a Yerek. But at the same time, Rabbi Gamliel says that as far as Shvius is concerned, we go Basa Chanota. So what's the din of an Esrog that has Chanota in Shvius, but the Lakita was in Shminis? Do we say that we should go after Chanota because in Shvius we go Basa Chanota? And hence it would be potem in a maser, like an esrog of shvius, even though the lakita took place in shminis. Or perhaps, in a case with the lakita in shminis, we should equate the esrog in shvius with the esrog in maser. Just like in maser, we said as lina basa lakita like in yerek, so too we should be consistent in shvius and go basa lakita. Therefore, he's chayav in maser because it's an esrog of shminis. The lakita took place in the shminis. So since Rabbah vacillated back and forth, he had a suffix with regard to Shvius, and Shvius is a doraisa. So we apply the principle of suffix doraisa l'chumra, and we consider it as pero Shvius because the Chanota took place in Shvius. And at the same time, we're going to say he's potem in a maser because he has to be mafkir his field. Since he applies the principle of suffix doraisa l'chumra, and therefore, as a result of the chanota in shvius, he's going to have to be mafkir his peros. Hence, they're peros of hefker, l'maisa the hefker. That's how we have to be knowing because suffix doraisa l'chumra based on the chanota b'shvius. So therefore, he's chayav in biur, but he's potem in a maser, and then applying the same yardstick in the Rosh in the case of Bashiches, since the Lakita took place in Shvius, and we now have to be machmir that perhaps the esrog with regard to Shvius should be compared and equated with the esrog with regard to maser, and that means therefore that we go basa Lakita, like a yerek in maser. Because an esrog is like a yerek. And if that be the case, then it belongs to Shminis. It belongs to Shvius. Because the Chanot, although the Chanot took place in Shishis, the Lakita took place in Shvius. And that Lakita, L'chumra, in a suffix doraisa, has to be treated as Kedushas Peros Shvius. You have to be mafkir your karka, your peros, and hence your potem and amas. However, Ela Reisha, Turin Abirama, says Abai, I don't understand. How could you say that in the case where the Chanot of the Peres was in Shishis, but the Lakita was in Shvius, how could it be part of an Abir? I mean, now you're being makil, and we apply the principle of Safik D'Oraisa L'Chumra. Rabbi, you should be consistent, and if you're Choshesh, for that man the Omar, who holds that since the Lakita was in Shvius, therefore, we give the Esrog in Shvius the same dinim as the Esrog in Masros. If Azlin and Basal Lakita, these payros, this Esrog has Kedusha Shvius. So how can you say that he's Potum in Abiur? Now you're claiming that we could be machriya the suffix in favor of chanot, and therefore it has the status of shishis. You're telling me that he's not chayav b'maaseh because he has to treat it l'chumra, as if it was perish shvius because the fact that Lakitu was in shvius, and therefore you're saying that he's potum in amasin. So once he's saying that you have to be machbir and be mafkir your peros because the Lakita was in shvius, then how can you be makil in a suffix D'Oraisa with regard to mitzvah's biur? As far as biur is concerned, you also have to be machbir. You're telling me that you have to be mafkir the peros because of the chumrah, that it has kedusha shvius because of the Lakita in shvius. So once you're being machbir for shvius, then it should be chayav in biur based on the application of the same principle of Safik D'Oraisa L'Chumra. Amalei, so Rabbi says Tabaye, that in truth, forget about Safik. I'm not vacillating back and forth. I'm going to assume that Chanota determines the year and the Kedusha Shvius, which means that in the first case of Rabbah, the Reish of Rabbah, where the Chanota took place in Shishis, the parents have no Kedusha Shvius. So if that be the case, why are you potum in Amasa? You don't even have to be mafkir your parents. So there's no hefkir, you had to potum it for Masa. And Rabbah answers, Yad HaKol Mimash B'Shin Ba. Since you're in the 7th year, you have to open up your field for everybody to come in and take the Paris of Shvius. Now, it's true, they don't have rights to take the Esrog because the Esrog had Chanot in Shishis, and therefore it doesn't have the status of Paris Shvius. It belongs to the Bailan. But on the other hand, Lamaisi, you have to be mafkir your field. Your field has to be open up. Everyone can come in. And the reason for that is because it's Shvius as far as every other aspect of payros, right? In other words, all the chitim and all other payros. So therefore, you cannot be shomer your esrog. You really don't have control and security to protect your esrogim. Everyone's coming into your field, and therefore, ad amr techayev v'maser. He asks it, Rabbi, as a rhetorical question. You want to say he's chayev v'maser? He's certainly part of a maser. It's hefker, because everyone has access to his esrogim. And Rav Hanuna disagrees. Rav Hanuna holds that we have to go consistently, that Peros and Esrog, or at least an Esrog, but the Rishonim seem to assume in all Peros, that we go Batzah Chanota. And therefore, says Rav Hanuna, if we're going Batzah Chanota, then Bashishis is Netzel Shvius, the Olam Shishis. We don't have any elements here of a P'tur Maser of Shvius. It's not Shvius at all. It's 100% Shishis, and you're Chayv in Maser. You have to be mafkir your peros because the Lakita took place in Shvius, and therefore every Tom, Dick, and Harry is going to come into your field and they'll start taking your esrogim. That's gezel. I don't have to worry about gazlonim. There's no status of hefker on the esrogim. The esrogim is basa chanot, and chanot took place in shishis, and there's no status of shvius here. It's mainly a chayv in maser. But shvius had it necessary shvius li olam shvius. Okay, here he doesn't disagree at all with Rabbi. He agrees that since the chanot took place in shvius, it has kedushas peros shvius, and therefore its status is that of peros shvius, as if it had grown during Shvius because the Chanata was in Shvius. Either Lakita was in Shvius, doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. Hakol Basar Chanata. And it's Potem in Amase. And it's Chayim and Beer. So in terms of Lamaisa, after we summarize this, if you have Peros of an Esra, and the Chanata took place in Shishis, and the Lakita in Shvius, there's going to be a machlokus between Rabbah and Rav Hamnun as far as Masas. So Rabbah is going to pater him up from Masa because it's the Lakita was during Shvius when the whole field is open to every, as we said before, every person who can come in, and therefore it's hefker, you can't be shomer. And he's pater in Masa. Rav Hamnun says, no, he's chayiv in Masa. But there's no machlokus in the Sefer in the case where the Chanata was in Shvius and the Lakita was in Shminis. Both Rav and Rav Hamnuna agree that it's Peros Shvius, L'chol Adinu, it's got Kedusha Shvius, it's Potem in Amasa Chayv B'Bir. So the Gemara now is going to ask a kasha from a brisa on Rav Hamnuna's din, and also on the second case, which is, as we said before, unanimous. Meisvei Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Shimon Esrog Bashishish and Etneses Lushvius Turim and Amase. So far, it sounds like Rabbah, because Rabbah was the one who said that even though we go Basar Chanata, nevertheless, because the Lakita took place in Shvius, and it's Yad HaKol B'Mashushin Ba, therefore it's Potem in Amase. But this is against Rav Hamnuna. And then it says P'turim min Abir. P'tura min Abir. And why is that? Just 1 second. Because the Chanata was in Shishis. Okay, so that's very good. Chanata was in Shishis, and therefore it's Potem min Abir. Why is it Potem min Amase? We could always apply Rabbi's principle of Mashmashim. So we see that we go Basar Chanata, the Chanata was in Shishis, and yet it's Potem in Amasa. However, this price offers a different reason why it's Potem in Amasa. She'ein lecha davar shechayiv b'maser, elim kein gadol b'chiyuv v'nilkat b'chiyuv. In order to be chayiv in Masa, we have to fulfill 2 conditions. We need that the Chanata take place in the year that you're chayiv in Masa. Okay, so here we have a case where the Chanata was in Shishis. But we also need Nilkat b'chiyuv. We need that the Lakita take place in a year in which you're chayiv in Masa. These peros, even though the Torah doesn't require you to be mafkir them, because the Chanata was in Shishis and they don't have the sanctity of Kedusha Shvius, but nevertheless, since the Lakita took place in Shvius, therefore, you're Potem in Amasa. So this is a separate din of P'tur Maser in a case where the Lakita was in Shvius, which means that the peros are mufkarim. Now we go on to the second case of Rabbi Shimon. The Esrog had Chanata in Shvius and the Lakita was in Shvius. P'turim min Amaser, that's fine. But then it says P'turim min Abir. Why is that? I mean, after all, if you're going Basar Chanata, and the Chanata took place in Shvius, the parents are sanctified with Kedusha Shvius, that's why you're Potem min Amaser. Why are you Potem min Abir? And the answer is she'ein lecha davar shechayev b'biur elam ke'gadol b'shvius v'nilkat b'shvius. It's interesting. Just like we said, you're not chayev in Maser, unless you have both Chanata and Lakita b'chiyuv in a year of chiyuv. So too, you're not kadosh b'kedusha shvius unless you had both Chanata and Lakita b'shvius. And the chiyuv bir min Torah only applies to peros that had Lakita and Shvius, and here you delayed the Lakita until Shminis. So the Gemara says, Reisha Kasha l'Rav Hamnuna, Seifa Kasha bein l'Rav Hamnuna. The rate of this price is against Rav Hamnuna because Rav Hamnuna never accepted a ptur maser in the case of chanota b'shishis. And that we said supported Rabbah. But the seifa of Rabbi Shimon is against both Rabbah and Rav Hamnuna, because they both would say that Yechayev in Biur in this case, because since we go Basar Chanota, and the Chanot took place in Shvius, then Yechayev in Biur. Whereas this Brisa, in the name of Shimon, offers an opinion in which you need Lakita during Shvius, and here the Lakita was in Shvinis, in order to be Chayev in Biur. And if you put them in a Biur, Sigvaretz is Tanoi. The Tana of this Brisa, which is Rabbi Shimon, is against the Tana of another Brisa, which we're about to quote. And therefore, Rav Hamnuna and Rabbah have the license to hold like the Tana in the following Brisa. The Sanya, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Av Tulmos, there's a whole discussion here about his name, and so forth. So anyway, he was one of the Chachamim. Hey, Mishum Chamishas Kenu, Esro, Achar Lekitaso Lemaser. Okay, this is not going to help Rabbah and Rav Yosef and Rav Hamnuna, but we'll get to Rabbi Seinu Ba'usha in a second. But as far as Avtulmus is concerned, his testimony in the name of the five Chachamim, Esrog Achar Lekitaso Lemaser. It has the same status as a yerek with regard to Maser. And everything depends upon Lakita. So, for example, let's say it reached Chanot in the second year, but it only was harvested in the third year, then you'd be Mafresh Maser on it. If, on the other hand, let's say it was harvested in the fourth year, then you'd be Chai Maser Sheni. So, according to this Shita, everything that in the Esrog depends totally on Lakita. I mean, that's antithetical to what we've been saying until now in the name of Rabbah and Rav Hamnuna. But the good news is, Rabbi Seinu Nimnu Bi'usha, they took a vote on some sort of there was a dissension, there was a debate, and they took a vote in the Sanhedrin in Usha. That's where it says Sanhedrin went into Golos in Usha right before the Churban. And in any event, they can be machriya based on Rov Deos that what the halach is in Esrog B'Yomer. They came to the conclusion Achal L'Kitaso Bein L'Maser Ubein L'Shvius. Now we're going to soon see that you can't read it as is, because we've been discussing Maser, and we said that it's Achal L'Kitaso L'Maser. Fine, we equate Esrog with the Yerek as far as Maser is concerned. The determining factor is the year of Lakita. But now all of a sudden you threw in Shvius. And Shvius, L'chor, depends upon Chanota, not on Lakita. So whereas Shvius, Mandikar Shmei, who mentioned Shvius over here? All of a sudden at the end of the Brisa, you shtup in Shvius,